let's see here. Got it. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it's like they've added features for they've added an app part. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, a lot of the things that they view as improvements. Same thing with the phone. I hate some of the upgrades.
Yep. Well, let's look at Miss Esther here. So yes, I was going through my my spreadsheet, and I realized that for my section about Esther, I had just put Esther later chapters, that is to say, later than Queen Vashti, and I had taken study questions from some of my commentary books, but I hadn't actually narrowed down what specific chapters and verses in Esther I wanted to share with the congregation. So I've been doing a little bit of that this morning, just trying to really get the meat of the story. So shall we have a moment of prayer to orient and then delve in?
Sure.
All right. Let us pray. Merciful God, you give us examples of so many people in this holy text of yours that have taken actions out of faith, sometimes terrifying actions. They have used knowledge available to them. They have used the systems both within it and without it. Help us to discover the analogies, even across cultures, that we may gain your wisdom from studying your people of faith. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So Diane said on Sunday that she would probably not be able to be here today. And with Susan being away at Beards Hollow, I didn't specifically talk with her if she would be coming on for these Tuesday things, but I imagine not. And I haven't heard from Denise recently, so I want to talk with her soon again. So it looks like at least for right now, it's just you and I. Oh yes, and Harriet has had various other appointments, so she wasn't able to read through the text and look at the questions either. So that brings us to the book of Esther. So on Sunday, we just really, this past Sunday, it was all chapter 1, all Queen Vashti, as you and I talked about last Tuesday. And then the next bit is all about Esther. Now it's interesting because I've got 2 different Bibles in front of me. And one of them very specifically has the book of Esther, and it's just the Hebrew version. Another Bible that I have in front of me combines the Greek version with the Hebrew version, and so there's additional chapters that have been put into it. And some of the extended letters that are sent out to the kingdom are included in the Greek version. So it's very interesting from kind of an overall study, but we don't have time on Sunday morning to get into all of that. So what I want to do is really narrow down what is the essentials of the story that gets the point across of really, what happened with Esther, with Haman and Mordecai and the king. Really showing how various power dynamics affected things. But I also don't want to take up 9 chapters because we just don't have time for that. So really, chapter 2 is how Esther became queen. but it also gets into a little bit about how Mordecai, Esther's uncle, discovers a plot against the king. And then Mordecai and Esther are able to tell the king about what's going on, to foil this plot against him. In a nutshell, while the king is thankful that this plot was foiled, you learn some chapters later that the king never actually rewarded Mordecai for his service. Meanwhile, Haman, I love the phrase in the NRSV that Haman, let's see here. Oh, never mind. I thought that Haman advanced himself, but I misinterpreted that. But basically, King Xerxes advanced Haman for some reason, and we don't exactly know what he did to come into favor. But Haman came into favor, and the king said that people should bow down to Haman, but Mordecai did not. And then this sets up, the relationship between these two fellows, that Haman, wants to get back at Mordecai, but doesn't want to directly kill him at this point. So he tries to go after Mordecai's people. So then the decree is written, that the Jewish people can be attacked by the various armies, and Mordecai mourns and goes through. He clothes himself in sackcloth and ashes, crying. Esther tries to send him clothes and things to get him to stop doing this. And then we kind of get into one of the really meats of the story in chapter 4, verses 9 through 17, about whether or not Esther can approach the king. I've been kind of going through all this very, very quickly. And I think actually you did a bit of a Bible study with Wiawaka about this chapter, didn't you? Or
Yeah.
about the story, didn't you?
Of the book, about Esther, yes.
Yeah. So I guess before we go any farther, was there anything in that particular Bible study that that you would like to see addressed, or that people had questions about?
No, I don't, and I didn't get out my notes and so forth. Things have been a little nutty, as you can imagine. But I was just noticing a section. This book is Just Wives, and it has a number of women, stories of power and survival in the Old Testament and today. So Sarah, Ruth and Naomi, Abigail, then the ones we're going to talk about in Wiawaka, Gomer. Anyway, but there's a section of the chapter on Vashti and Esther where the title for the section is Beauty Conquers All. It was the end of the first paragraph. Male and female scholars alike are divided over Esther's portrayal in the book. Some scholars have seen the main protagonist not as Esther, but as Mordecai, since he sends her instructions and eventually receives the king's signet ring. Others have focused on Esther's physical appearance as her principal asset. One writes, for example, that Esther is the stereotypical woman in a man's world. She wins favor by the physical beauty of her appearance and then by her ability to satisfy sexually.
And that actually plays into a little bit with Vashti being known as right, being beautiful. Yeah. Was there more in that book that?
Well, as I said, I haven't had time to read it all over again. and then there might be things that would pop out at me.
Mhm.
In the harem, Esther won favor with the man in charge of the harem, the eunuch. The Hebrew verb chosen by the narrator indicates that the favor was the result of Esther's action rather than being passively acquired.
Hmm. So in other words, she has agency.
Yeah. And Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. So
Mhm.
she's a quiet sort, but that doesn't mean she's not thinking.
Right. Right. Yeah, one of the study questions that I put out in the newsletter, or in the reminder today when I finally got it out, was compare Vashti's outspokenness and Esther's quiet nature. Who is the stronger woman?
Well, I would consider them strong in different ways.
Me too.
With a lot of people, that's, people are assertive or they're not, but that's not always an indicator of true strength.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, Vashti, by we don't actually hear Vashti say anything. Honestly, we learn that she refused to come out before the king, but we actually hear Esther's words, which is very interesting, considering that Vashti has this reputation for being, outspoken and bold, but we don't actually read her words. Whereas Esther, we have this impression that she's the quieter one, that she doesn't rock the boat, and yet we actually have a recording of the things that she, in theory, said. But yeah, I absolutely agree that they were strong in different ways, and I actually think that so in chapter 4 there, Esther, goes on to say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. And so that's verses 11. Verse 11. It's a long verse. And I can't help but think that that she would have known what had happened to Vashti. She would have been aware of what happened, and so really staying within the rules of approaching the king, that probably would have been very much in her mind of, this could be risky business, approaching the king without being called, which is kind of the inverse of what Vashti did, which was she refused to come to the king's presence when she had been called.
We don't really know what happened to Queen Vashti, do we? Whether she just lived out her life in the harem. Yeah. It doesn't say she was put to death, so I kind of think she wasn't, but
yeah. I agree. I think that probably what happened is, she became, she was stripped of her title. I think, that she was stripped of her title, and she the king had so many wives. Not
right.
all of them would have been in the same palace at the same time. There was probably a couple of other palaces that had other wives, and so she was probably shunted off to one of those other palaces, banished from the king's presence, or name never said. But since we don't see that she was put to death, I think that she was just forgotten.
And I suspect that she had strong political family connections to have gotten to be queen in the first place, and that may have been what protected her from being put to death. I don't know. I'm just like you were just guessing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that is, it's speculation, but it feels right. and part of the reason why it feels right is because we don't actually see evidence of her having been put to death. Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, Vashti is never again to come before the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is, better than she. So I think that she was just banished to namelessness in one of the other palaces. Because I agree that politically he couldn't do anything other than that against her. He couldn't divorce her. He couldn't send her back to her family. He couldn't kill her. So yeah, I think that she just became a nameless wife. Which is awful, but
Oh,
but
she wasn't the only one by any means.
no,
And
there's
yeah.
yeah, they probably, there's a whole bunch of them that they just, it was just how they lived together. So yeah, it probably wasn't the best life in the world, but she
No,
had a life.
right. It probably, considering the times, it probably wasn't the worst life either.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure she was assured of, enough food and all that, so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she may have had to share her room.
Who knows?
Yeah, it's a little bit disturbing, to think about what might have happened, because we don't know. And the culture is so different. I mean, the yes, Esther was queen, but we know that she was in this harem with so many others, and yeah, as you say, she had to be somehow assertive, and somehow have agency, enough agency to be seen, to be known. But Esther herself even says, I can't approach the king. He hasn't called for me. I haven't seen him in a month. I can't do this that you're asking me to do, uncle. And then finally she gives him instructions, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish.
Mhm.
And in that last verse, I actually see echoes of Vashti's determination. Because in Vashti's case, she knew that if she said no to the king, she could be killed. She also could be killed if she came before everyone, with the king's order. And so she took a gamble. She took a risk. And here Esther is doing the same thing. She's taking a gamble, taking a risk. What could happen? Yeah, Esther could lose her place by making this choice.
You know what, something else interesting about this book,
Mhm.
is there's no mention of any offspring for either Vashti or, we don't know if Vashti ever had any children or Esther, and they're not in any of the genealogies, I believe. I don't know. I
That
mean,
is a good
it
point.
wouldn't be
Yeah,
Vashti anyway, it would be Esther, but
yeah,
I don't know if she's mentioned.
yeah. Esther is remembered um, for the sake of Purim. It's a time of feasting and celebration, because the Jews in exile in Susa, were saved by what Esther did. It mentions at the very end of chapter 10, Mordecai's descendants.
Huh.
But yeah, I don't actually see anything
But
in a quick scan.
if Esther had descendants, they would have been the king's heirs rather than hers. So
Yeah.
although Ruth in the New Testament genealogies, Ruth is mentioned, Tamar.
Mhm. Yeah, there's 4 women who are mentioned in
Right.
the Matthew's genealogy, and Esther's not one of them.
Right.
So yeah, this book, it's an interesting little book. Yeah, the as you mentioned last week, famously, the Hebrew version of Esther does not mention God at all. The Greek Septuagint translation that does mention God, and it's considerably longer and has, in theory, copies of the various letters that the king and other folks sent out to the kingdom. But yeah, the Hebrew version does not actually mention God. It's in some ways very strictly a political story, political theater. So another interesting thing about this book is, so in the first chapter, you have this lavish party, and the banquet, after Esther is selected as queen, the king throws a banquet for Esther. Now it doesn't say anything about who came to this banquet or anything, just that it's Esther's banquet. And he also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. And then Esther herself, when she's making her appeals to the king, the first time that she comes before the king, she doesn't ask for a favor for her people. She asks if she can hold a banquet for the king and Haman. And then at the second banquet, at that first banquet that she holds for the king, very private audience, she then asks to hold a second banquet. And then it's at that second one that she actually tells the king what Haman is plotting to do to her people. So it's a very interesting use of power that Esther does. Meanwhile, of course, Haman is planning to hang Mordecai.
Right.
So yeah, that's the problem with this, is there's a lot going on in this book. And I left my book home that tells me, the Women of the Old Testament book that tells me, what parts of some of these Old Testament stories actually come up in the lectionary. So that'll be something that I need to look up, is whether or not any of this actually does come up in the lectionary. But it's still, even if some of it does come up, it's not the whole thing. And the whole story is really interesting. And then you get into chapter 9, which is, the destruction of the enemies of the Jews. And that's a little bit tough to read. So yeah, the really chapters 2 through 8 are really this story of what Esther did. And that's a little bit long for a Sunday morning.
Oh, and actually, and it's kind of funny too, because at the banquet for just Haman and King and Queen Esther, and the king got up in a rage, left his wine and went out into the palace garden.
Mhm.
And throws himself on the couch with Esther. It's sort of like a little bit like the scene with Joseph and Potiphar's wife.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
the king comes back and thinks he's molesting Esther.
Yep. And you do wonder, was he so enraged that he actually, put hands on the queen? He could have. He could have. So there's more power dynamic. I don't have any more tea. Oh no. So yeah, how Haman is just as fragile as the seven advisors from last week. Um, he's very concerned about his own importance, concerned about people bowing to him. When he points his finger, he wants his power, and when it's thwarted, he reacts very badly to that.
It's also interesting that Xerxes gives Esther Haman's estate.
Mm-hmm. And then Esther puts Mordecai in it.
Charge of it, yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. You mentioned that one of the traditional interpretations of the story is, about Mordecai being, the real hero and the brains behind the story, because he's the schemer who plots to have his ward in a position of power. He influences her to use her position for his gain. He's the one that discovers the initial plot to kill the king, and kind of, really does a lot of behind the scenes stuff. It is a very traditional interpretation of the story. But then another interpretation is that Esther herself had limited power in the system, and yet she uses what little she has and the few tools available to a woman in her position. She was the politically fragile replacement wife of this, short fused, volatile king. And yet she uses what little she has in order to effect change for marginalized people. In some ways, when Vashti stood up for herself and, said, no, I'm not going to come before you. She set an example for standing up for, for someone who's facing an unjust situation. And Esther just really expands that and stands up for people on a much larger scale, using the tools that she had available to her and using them skillfully and wisely to affect change. In chapter 8, verse 3, this is after, as you saw, that Xerxes had given Queen Haman's household, and she, put Mordecai over it. And then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, if it pleases the king and I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? So, yeah, it's a very interesting story. But again, here she, she's been given all these favors by the king at this point, and yet she has found the strength to come before the king and to make these, pleading appeals, and it works. So one of the study questions that I shared was, Vashti refused to go to the king after being invited. Esther refused to go to the king without an invitation. Eventually, Esther approaches the king even without being summoned first, because in every possible outcome she could foresee, her own life was at risk. What hope can we derive from these two opposing yet brave actions? I mean, for me, it's, look out for where there is injustice, and it'll take different actions each time with each different situation.
This morning, in the upper room, the devotional was written by a woman from the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And she said when she was growing up and they were still under the Soviet regime, they were, she and a few other friends were Christian, or family, I don't know where, she grew up in a Christian family. And of course, the Soviet regime was atheist, and they had a youth group, and in school there were these different things that they were really not physically persecuted, but they were persecuted. She would get a lower grade on things than the students who were loyal to the Soviets, and her name would be removed. She was applying to college, and her name was actually removed from the applications, which I assume was sort of a group application. And then there was this youth group, sort of like Scouts, but it was the communist version, which I had heard of before, and they wouldn't join that. And they really had it was mainly verbal abuse, and then this kind of thing of, lower grades and so forth. And then after the regime changed, and they could worship openly and so forth. And she happened to be going down the street, and she had met one of her former teachers, and he came and apologized to her and said how much he had admired her faith at the time, but he didn't dare. He wasn't brave enough to give her the grade she deserved, or whatever the other things were. And it was just, to me, it was an interesting thing of, it isn't necessarily that your life is at stake, but there's, people may make fun of you or whatever, and just yeah.
You said that was in the upper room devotional for today?
Yes. Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I read Daily Bread and Upper Room. I'm sure it was in the upper room, because those are written by people from various places.
Yeah. That's quite the witness, quite the story. So I'll have to look that up. Yeah, those sorts of situations happen, unfortunately, in different ways all the time. Yeah, but that's quite the witness.
Wasn't there, who knows, what was that statement? Who knows if this is what God had intended for you all along, or some.
Yeah, that is.
I think Mordecai said it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, it's chapter 4, verses 13. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." And that was the argument that convinced her to fast and to go forward with her plan once she came up with a plan. Yeah, that verse about "for such a time as this," it has become very much a rallying cry for a lot of social justice. Excuse me. It is. I'm having a really hard time with a cough right now. That's why I keep clearing my throat. Yeah, there's been quite a number of different both justice organizations and but also some preaching preaching conferences that all use this this verse as inspiration for such a time as this. And honestly, I think that it's more appropriate to use it for various justice organizations, because that's the original use of it. On the other hand, prophetic preaching that really speaks inspirationally about what's going on and gets people to actually think about justice and about what people are facing. I can see it, that also being an appropriate use. But yeah, the verse, it's almost as if the verse has become more popular than the story itself in some ways.
But I also was thinking about, he was a friend of ours, but he was also the youth minister at our church in Massachusetts. And he really wanted to be a missionary. He was, he must have been at Gordon Conwell, because that's where we got most of our youth ministers. But he wound up going to Uzbekistan. And he really wasn't cut out to be a missionary. However, while he was in Uzbekistan, he met and married an Uzbek woman whose family had been Muslim. She created to Christianity. They disowned her. Her family disowned her. Dave and I know one of their children was born in Uzbekistan, but they moved back to the United States. And Dave went into back into the business realm he had been involved with earlier. His father developed Alzheimer's and needed extra help. But Feruza, his wife, got involved in Bible translation. She translated the Bible into, and I think she's still working on it, but she started with the New Testament, translated it into Uzbek, has been back to Uzbekistan a number of times. Her family has converted. Wow. She has done all kinds of missionary things that Dave was not destined or whatever, was not blessed with that ability. But what he did led to her ability to do something. I mean, we so often don't know how things are going to work out. God has a plan, but it's just, we don't always see that plan. We want to do it our way.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's Yoda that says something about, the failure being the best teacher.
Yeah.
That's I think that you shared a little bit of that story in one of these previous Tuesday groups, but yeah, it's still an incredible story.
But I hadn't really thought of, Dave's desire and true longing to be a missionary. He really wanted to do that. I don't doubt his sincerity at all. That just wasn't what God wanted him to do. And
it wasn't his gift.
Right.
Yeah. But through that experience,
right.
Someone rose up who was very gifted at being, at providing this sort of mission work. So yeah, that's another, really incredible story. Yeah. Yeah, so he wasn't called to be a missionary.
Right.
Yeah.
What did Harriet have to say?
She wasn't able to,
Oh,
yeah. Because I got the study questions out too late and she had another appointment. So so no, she wasn't able to participate like she normally does. Yeah, I don't know why I forgot to include it in last Thursday's Bible study, because normally I try to give, you know, at least some hint in the not in Thursday Bible study, in Thursday newsletter. And I didn't get it into the newsletter, and then I didn't get it on Sunday's worship videos. I normally do then too, and so it fell to this morning. So let's see here. I had another, let's see here. So another one of the study questions that I had put forward is, I think that this question came directly out of that book that I talked about. How is Mordecai's behavior patterned after Vashti's? How do Esther, that's a misspelling there. Esther, Haman, and the king each respond, especially remembering Vashti's experience. So this actually addresses when in chapter 3, after these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would avail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated, but he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So that's where that particular question came from, in terms of Mordecai's actions being patterned after Vashti's. So let's see, that question again was, how is Mordecai's behavior patterned after Vashti's? How do Esther, Haman, and the king each respond, especially remembering Vashti's experience?
well, I mean, Mordecai's refusal to bow down was really faith-based. And Vashti's was not,
Right.
so it's kind of an opposite point of view rather than seeing them as similar. I mean, having the will to resist, I guess, is the
Yeah.
Vashti and Mordecai would be what they had in common,
Yep.
but their motives were very different.
I agree. And it does get into a little bit, when Haman's, talking to King Xerxes, he basically says, you've got these people who are kind of scattered throughout this kingdom who don't follow your commands, and it's bad because they're not listening to you, and the Jewish people, they would participate in what they wanted to participate in. They weren't rebelling against the king. They just didn't want to bow down to anyone except for God. Although that specific who they do want to bow down to isn't in the Hebrew version of Esther, and I don't know if it's in the Greek version because I don't have that one open right now.
No, but it's sort of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right.
A similar kind of.
Yep. And but the similarities in the story is, how fragile Haman is. He's he he responds to Mordecai's refusal to bow, similar to how Xerxes had responded to Vashti's refusal to come before him. It's, how dare they? And I'm going to overreact because I can.
I don't know if you're aware, but one of something I like a lot are called Hamantaschen. And
I heard that name
they're
before.
sort of like a goulash. It's a Jewish
Yes,
treat,
yes.
and they serve it during Purim.
Mhm.
And it's sort of, the crust on it is pinched into sort of a tri-cornered hat.
Yeah.
And it's usually, my favorite is the one that has poppy seed in it. There are
Oh, yeah.
other ones as well. But it's funny that they're supposed to resemble Haman's hat. That's why they're called Hamantaschen.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Um, and why did he really wear a three-cornered hat? I mean, it's one of those weird little, yeah.
Hmm.
But Purim is when you can get them at a Jewish bakery. So
Right.
this Just Wives book says, does the violent ending of the story in chapter 9 affect your ability to relate to Esther?
Well, that's a good question.
Well, honestly, it doesn't bother me at all. I mean, when you consider things like the Warsaw Ghetto, or just any number of things, I don't have a problem with them fighting back. And in my view, Haman got what he deserved. He just, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because when you read through chapter 9, and you think of the sheer number of people affected. I mean, yes, there's, the if I remember correctly, the thing that Xerxes said is that while he couldn't completely go against the
Right,
what Haman had already put out, he basically told the Jewish people, well, you can defend yourselves.
right.
Um, you can fight back, you can defend yourselves. I'm not gonna stand in your way of that. And I think, I mean, that's a lot of carnage that happens
Right.
in this book. And the I also think of the Maccabees situation. They were attacked on their Sabbath day, and so there were people who said, well, we can't fight back because it's our Sabbath day. And then the Maccabees, that pack of brothers, got people to actually fight back, to defend themselves, even though it was their Sabbath day. And um, and so I can't help but think, couldn't Xerxes have done something else? Instead of just telling them that, well, you can fight back, couldn't he have used some of his power to actually stop it from happening in the first place?
Well, I don't know, because the law of the land was, once an edict had been issued, it
Right.
couldn't be withdrawn, which seems bizarre too, but
Exactly.
yeah.
It seems really bizarre. Yeah, it seems extremely bizarre that this all-powerful king that he's trying to put himself as couldn't go against an order.
Right. And
Couldn't counter him.
it's almost like they had some kind of constitution that was passed on, survived not just one king, but a succession of kings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes. I mean, that's the first verse there. It's, you kind of have this, it almost feels as if, this part of the chapter was written, well after things happened, and they're going back and writing about it. But still, it's a tough read for me, that last chapter, because I can't help but think that it didn't have to be that way. That was a really good question, though, from your book. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then by the end of chapter 9, you see that Esther is now also able to send letters through this by now famous letter writing service, the post office. Letters were sent wishing peace and security to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, and giving orders that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as the Jew Mordecai and Queen Esther enjoined on the Jews, just as they had laid down for themselves and for their descendants regulations concerning their fasts and lamentations. The command of Queen Esther fixed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Yeah, it's quite the story. But yeah, it almost, in some ways, it seems as if it is this is the story of how this holiday came to be. And some parts of it seem larger than life. Some parts of it seem, just not really far-fetched, but almost as if there's some exaggeration going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, where was that? The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa, in just kind of rounded numbers,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a story meant to impress. It's a story meant to sensationalize in some ways. I mean, the essence of the story is it's political theater in some ways. How do you have people who are in exile trying to live in this land where the rules are different from what they know, and how can they actually survive in this land that isn't their promised land? What are some of the things that are against them? So yeah, for Sunday, when it comes to the story the scripture to actually read, I'm still trying to figure out what the best thing would be to do. A couple of verses here and there scattered throughout the chapters, that might be the best thing to do. because there's a lot of descriptions in it. Yeah, there's a lot of descriptions, there's a lot of back and forth, and I want to get the main story out to people so that people can know what's going on and yet still leave time to actually talk about it. Is there anything in particular, Arlene, that that leaps out to you as something that that was surprising, something that you would like to hear spoken about?
Well, I'm just looking back at the beginning of the chapter in Just Wives. It's a traditional tale of intrigue involving Jews in a foreign royal household, like the story of Abraham in the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh. It doesn't mention Moses, growing up in Pharaoh's larger household, or Daniel in the court of Babylon. Whatever the background of the story, it is surely based in Jewish experience of fear and persecution in Persian times. Yeah, I think the overall lessons are what's important about it, not so much
the details.
Yeah. I know there are so many, some of the things we've mentioned, whatever happened to Queen Vashti and so forth, aren't really, that's really not critical at all.
But it still colors the story because, there's that shadow of Vashti. Oh, and I just realized that it's approaching 1 o'clock and I actually have to lead another Bible study for the pastors. So, so I should actually get that one because I have to log out of my Zoom account and log into another one in order to lead that Bible study. Oh gosh. So yeah, if something occurs to you throughout the week that that you think might be, something that you'd like to know more about, send me a note, give me a call, and I'll definitely be, choosing, somehow conveying the overall story of Esther on Sunday. Yeah. Shall we have a moment of prayer? All right. Merciful God, we thank you for the opportunity to read and study your word, and be with us as we go forward this day. Help us to identify the systems of injustice that you would have us tear down by any means available to us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thanks a lot, Arlene.